Welcome over to Automotive World, everyone. I'm your host, Vinay Mishra. We have a really interesting story coming out regarding one of the most highly anticipated EVs, not only here in America, but coming from Stellantis. We have a statement from CEO Carlos Tavares saying that the $25,000 Jeep EV will arrive. It's coming to the US, and he says it's extremely soon. We've got some information over on from Motor One over here, so we're going to use their article, and we're going to dive in. We're going to go through all the information, and ultimately we're going to talk about this and see what we think of this. First of all, this is not the first time we have seen this specific vehicle. We have seen this shown off quite a few times. We already know that Jeep and Stellantis have done a number of things with electrification, in terms of full electrification, in terms of hybrid, and a lot of their vehicles, which they've actually made, pure EV, they've actually gone back and added in internal combustion engines. However, Jeep fully embracing the electrification. They don't have many options on there, but during a strategic decisions conference, their 40th annual strategic decisions conference, CEO Carlos Tavares said that it will arrive very soon in America, and it will expand the brand with a $25,000 EV. Going on that, they talk about at that strategic conference, how this is going to be done. And they talk about how they use the expertise designing the Citroen EC3, how they, in today's exchange rate, how, that affordable vehicle has helped them in other parts of the world launch and really expand the Stellantis portfolio overall. They talk about, obviously, not only keeping the price down, but the engineering behind it, being able to bring that over into the Jeep. This is really interesting. The $25,000 electric Jeep would be the brand's third EV for the US. Technically, this would be the first full EV. Obviously, the Wagoneer and the Grand Cherokee, having those hybrid models. But this would be the first battery electric vehicle for Jeep, the first full EV. Not an electrified model, but the first full EV. And Jeep has aimed this at the off-roaders. Obviously, that concept that we know, we've seen it before, the current name that we have for it is the Recon. Jeep has, when they first initially showed this concept here, they talked about it being the entry-level SUV for off-roaders, which is really interesting, because obviously when it comes to off-road, you don't necessarily need too much power, but you do need a decent amount of power. But what you really need is a lot of range, and especially when we look at currently right now in America, there's no $25,000 EVs, and even if we look at things like the Fiat 500e or the Mini Cooper EV, these are vehicles that have 120, 140 miles of range at best. And so, the fact that we would be off-road, we just haven't seen in America an EV at that price point with the range to say, hey, this is worth considering. And obviously a lot of people have been waiting for Tesla's Model 2, and we've seen obviously the news with Tesla, just with the EV charging network, how they've slowly pulled that back in order to bring back some money in terms of cash flow for development and other things like that. But also we've just seen too with Tesla, the new Model 3, the Cybertruck, there's so much demand for those vehicles, and they're behind in production quite a lot, and they're having a lot of issues with those vehicles. So the fact that we would get, and they're saying this is a $25,000 EV, they're not saying that's with or without incentives, but from what I'm taking from this, they're saying that this is going to start at $25,000. So if that was to be made here, plus with incentives, is that something, not only is it's affordable, obviously, but is it something that's actually worth it? And, we weren't able to really get much information from Carlos himself. Obviously, we've seen it. We know it looks quite like the Wrangler. It does have the boxy shape, which is accustomed to Jeeps, and I really like that. And unfortunately, like I said, Mr. Tavares did not offer any details beyond the model's price and the very vague arrival date. He said it's very soon, but he didn't say whether it's within this year or coming into next year. But we do have some cues. Obviously, they talk about them using the Citroen EC3. They talk about it with the price, but they also talk about it with the engineering. just being able, what they have learned from that to design that vehicle to, even in today's market, be affordable. Given that this is a small vehicle, given that this vehicle is going to be $25,000, it's not far off to assume that what they did with the Citroen would make its way to the Jeep. And because the Jeep would be a little bit higher price, maybe the Jeep might get a little bit more power and more range, but it wouldn't be unusual or surprising to see the Citroen powertrain, the Citroen battery, the Citroen engineering, and basically the Citroen become the Jeep. And we have some numbers down here that Motor One has gone through. The Citroen that is in question here is not a powerful car. It's not designed to be. It's 111 horsepower. It's not powerful at all. It's not fast. Obviously, being electric vehicles, they are heavier. So this is not a speed demon by any means. However, based on the European test cycle, it can go up to 199 miles per hour. Keep in mind, obviously in Europe, that test cycle is a bit different. Their speeds are generally not as high as ours, and generally they don't have to go as far of a distance. So obviously there is going to be some wiggle room and some anomalies in that specific test. However, when you look at it, that's started at 20,000 pounds, 22,000 in our market right now. $22,000 can get us 111 horsepower and 199 miles of range. Now, we have things that like the Fiat 500e and the Mini Cooper EV that are in the mid to low 30s. And they offer not as much range. They do offer a little bit more power, but even the range on that is not quite enough. The range on here for this is not going to be the same range because, number one, 111 horsepower, that is not enough horsepower. This is going to be an SUV. It's going to be small. This is going to be an SUV. It's going to be a battery EV. It's going to be heavy. It's not going to be enough power. Forget about even going to a track and things like that. That's just not going to be enough pulling power. Like if you're trying to do, an overtake on a 2-lane road, that's pretty dangerous. Obviously it's an EV, so it could have, like many of the EVs. Some of them, they, change the throttle mapping to make it more like a gas car, but obviously it can't have instant torque. But 111 horsepower isn't enough. Keep in mind, that's to one electric motor. When the Recon comes out, this could very well obviously be an all-wheel drive model. So I don't expect to be a quad motor on this just because it's not that type of performance, and ultimately this car is not competing in that type of price range. But maybe not for 25,000, but maybe for 30-something thousand, could we see a dual motor? And that would be a bit interesting. Because like I said, with this price, this is what we got. Let's say for 25,000, maybe we can get up to 150 horsepower or 180 horsepower or even 200 horsepower. We could very easily get to 200 horsepower in an electric motor. That is going to eat up the range quite a lot. But even though this is going to be a very similarly sized vehicle, it is going to be a little bit bigger. So maybe we might get a little bit more range. With the current market, though, the way that we see it, and I bring up Fiat because I bring up Mini and Fiat because right now they are the two smallest EVs in the United States. And obviously, Fiat being owned by Stellantis, that's one of their own brands. Obviously, it looks like the route Stellantis is taking is they're focusing more on what they did with Citroen. But if we look at the Fiat, which was, used to be Fiat Chrysler and things like that, and obviously that was all bought up by Stellantis. That's a vehicle, like I said, that gives us maybe 140 miles of range, and it's not very powerful. For 25,000, this to me, the horsepower is not a usable amount. It's just not enough. I'm not saying this thing needs to have 300-400 horsepower, because it doesn't. It really doesn't. I could understand maybe in like a single motor if we could get up to like 150, and then maybe obviously if this was to have all-wheel drive, which I feel like it would, using a dual motor setup, I feel like then maybe we could go to 250 horsepower. I feel like that would be a really nice sweet spot. You have enough power, and then you can get enough efficiency. If it went to 300 horsepower, that'd be great, but I don't think you're going to need 300 horsepower and something like this. I think really 250, 256, 260 is really plenty of power. But it's going to be a bit interesting, because if they're saying, if we're using this as the baseline, that's a $22,000 car, $25,000, a little bit bigger battery. Maybe we can get 100, even on, let's say, starting with just a single motor. Maybe we can get 150 something horsepower out of this, and maybe with a slightly bigger battery, maybe we can crack 220, 230 miles. Who's to say? Maybe we can even get somehow a slightly bigger battery in there with a dual motor setup. Maybe it might give us, like I said, that 250, 260 horsepower, maybe even 240, or even 245, I think would be plenty in this type of vehicle, especially being an EV with instant acceleration. You can get 200, maybe 80, 300 miles out of that, and maybe that's, if this is going to start at 25,000, maybe a dual motor version starts at 28 or 30. If you think about it, then for 28 or 30, that's starting, and depending on where obviously this can be made, if this can, be eligible for some incentives, I think for a lot of people who mainly just drive in the city or mainly just do 50 or 100 miles a day, I think a 25 to 30,000 EV with that kind of power and that kind of range might actually make a lot of sense for a lot of people. Obviously, it's gonna be, we're gonna have to see. What remains to be seen is what happens with this. Obviously, Jeep talks about the, what they've learned in using that engineering and things, but obviously we don't know if they're gonna use this. Maybe they might take some engineering cues and maybe some design cues, or who knows, they might even take some manufacturing cues from it, and we might have a completely different powertrain, completely different battery, and we might be looking at completely different numbers here. Maybe the numbers will be better, maybe they'll be worse, but it's going to be a bit interesting, because like I said, if that's a $22,000 vehicle, right, and we're looking at a minimum of $25,000 on a single motor, I don't see why, with a slightly bigger battery. And obviously, like I said too, this is based on the European test cycle. When it comes to the European test cycle, a lot of times they have been known to be extremely forgiving and really over quote what the range is. And obviously, when it comes to EVs, usable range is something entirely different. We have obviously seen Teslas, say, hey, we've got 312 miles of range or 280 miles of range, and then you're 140 miles in, and that you're out of battery. So we have seen with EVs that say, hey, 300 miles of range, and you're maybe getting 220 at most. So obviously, this number, like I said, with all of this is a bunch of potentials. There are a bunch of anomalies here, but I think it's a bit interesting. Whether what the usable range is, obviously we would have to wait for that vehicle to come out and we can obviously test it. But let's just say on an American cycle, this is 199 miles for this vehicle. Let's say on the American test cycle, this gets similar to the Mini Cooper. Or the Mini Cooper gets about 118 to 120 miles. The Fiat can get about 140. Let's say this gets 140 or 150. Let's put it in that era. You get a little bit bigger battery with maybe 150 horsepower. So maybe we're cracking 220 to 250 or 260 range. Maybe we can get another slightly bigger battery. Maybe with a dual motor. Maybe we can get if not 300, and that's not usable range, but if not 300, maybe close to 300. And that's maybe for, this is going to start at 25. Let's say a dual motor model goes for another 4,000. 29, like I said, under 30, it might make some sense. And this is going to be a bit interesting. The maximum horsepower is 117. With the manufacturer's estimated city range of 162 miles. Now, that's city range, it's not highway range. But keep in mind, the European test cycle we have known to be very forgiving. Sometimes they're more than 30, 40, 50 miles. Generally it's like 20 to 30 at most, but sometimes it's been more than that. When you think about it, 111 horsepower with 199 miles based on the cycle. When you have a Fiat that's 162 miles city range, but given that Europeans drive, generally more in the cities with that type of vehicle, let's say bring it down to the American testing, that's close to what we predicted, with 140 to 150 miles, maybe even 162, depending on, being a slightly larger vehicle. So when you think about that, 162 miles, 117 horsepower, very similar to 111 horsepower. Keep in mind, that's a $32,500 starting vehicle. It's about a $33,000 vehicle. But if Jeep is saying that they're going to do this for $25,000 and they're using those numbers, and keep in mind, this vehicle is sold here in the United States. So this is on Fiat USA's website. This is with testing for the American market. I know they're talking about using the Citroen platform a lot, but if you think about it, that Citroen platform is very similar to a platform that we already have right now with the Fiat 500e. So, obviously, we'll have to wait and see, because this will be a slightly larger vehicle. It's still going to be pretty small, but a slightly larger vehicle. But for $25,000, we'll have to wait and see, is this going to be the breakthrough electric vehicle that the world has been waiting for? Or is this just going to be another cheap car electric vehicle that we've seen from all the other automakers that doesn't have enough range and isn't a good value, and really ultimately is just kind of similar to what when Mazda came out with their EVs and things, and you could even argue with Mini and Fiat. Is this just going to be a compliance car? We'll have to wait and see, and ultimately we just have to wait to find out. Let me know what you guys and girls think down below in the comments. For $25,000, is this thing really going to be $25,000? Is this even when it comes out, is it going to be $25,000? Is that with or without incentives? Is that going to be a single motor, dual motor? What do you guys think? Is any of this even real? Is this car even ever going to come out? What you potentially think realistically we actually might see with this vehicle in terms of range and powertrain and things like that. Let me know what you guys think down below. That's going to do it